Hi, this is Josh Marshall, and this is the Josh Marshall Podcast with Kate Riga. We had a big election last night. I don't know how much, certainly, people in Ohio knew it was a big election because the turnout kind of told the tale there. I'm not sure how much people around the country knew there was a kind of a big election last night, unless people kind of like political junkies or pro-choice or pro-life activists who follows. But anyway, there was a referendum, or I guess I'm not sure what they call it in Ohio, but it's a ballot initiative to change the state constitution. And formally, what this vote was about was whether the Ohio state constitution would change so that when there are other ballot initiatives to change the state constitution, you would need a 60% threshold as opposed to a 50% threshold. So to make it substantially harder to change state constitution through, in different states they call these referenda, ballot initiatives, propositions, whatever, all basically the same thing. So, and needless to say, there are, I mean, on any question you can always get 50-50, right? But to get over 60% is a big hurdle, certainly in our politics. And if something has more than 60% support, generally you're not going to need to have a proposition or a referendum, right? I mean, if 80% of the public agrees on something, the state legislature is going to do it themselves, so there's kind of no need. In any case, that was formally what this vote was about. But really what it was about was abortion rights in the state of Ohio. Because this November, abortion rights supporters have collected enough signatures, actually way more than enough signatures, to put this on the ballot and to put basically a robust abortion rights protection language into the state constitution. Okay, so last night, this is basically an abortion rights vote, even though technically it wasn't like that. And what happened, well, the last time I looked last night, it was like 50, it went down by like 57%. So overwhelmingly, i.e. the pro-choice voters won. And a lot of people are very excited about this, understandably. This was basically an effort to short circuit this popular referendum in November to kind of, pull it back, the state legislature to pull it back, to not give the voters of the state that choice. And now it seems, I wouldn't take anything for granted, but it certainly seems highly likely that referendum will win in November, and then you're going to go back to having full abortion. I don't know exactly what the language is, but basically abortion will go back to being available in the state of Ohio. But this isn't the first time this has happened, right? I mean, you go back to just after the Dobbs decision, going on a year and a half ago, we had that a referendum in Kansas, and that was the first sort of like thunderclap heard across the political horizon in this country, where the pro-choice side won overwhelmingly, went into it kind of not knowing what was going to happen, and it was a total blowout. There was another case like this in Kentucky. I think last November is when it actually happened. Now, in that case, it didn't have a lot of practical effect because of what was being decided. If I recall right, the referendum was whether to basically ban abortion in the state constitution, and that went down to defeat, not overwhelmingly, but by a solid margin, something like 52-47 or something like that. So in that case, that was defeated, but you still have a state legislature who's doing the same thing. So it didn't have a big effect, but it still showed how in a very red state, abortion restriction can't win a fair vote, or any vote, really. Then we had the case in Michigan, again last November, where the state's voters put abortion rights into the state constitution by a big margin. And that is a case where it's not just that abortion rights have been guaranteed as much as a constitutional amendment can guarantee anything, but Gretchen Whitmer, the very successful governor of the state, she had a lot of other things going for her, but she basically used the choice issue on various fronts to leverage Democrats back into being in control of the whole state. What's been a very purple state. Republicans have controlled one or both houses of the legislature for decades. And as we know, it was a state that Donald Trump won in 2016 and came relatively close to winning, not close enough to even have it really be a close call, but still a relatively close race in 2020. So we had this happen, and as is often the case, it's hard to poll these contests because they tend to be off cycle, anti-abortion political forces tend to, schedule them overnight on Labor Day, so these kind of ridiculous times to try to get a very low turnout election where they think their voters can pull it out, and it doesn't work. And this happens again and again. And I think my gut told me, and I suspect other people probably thought the same thing, that it was going to be a similar result. But that was just kind of gut. There wasn't, I think there was one poll that showed the yes side winning and another poll that showed no winning overwhelmingly. But again, very hard to pull. And this just shows us it's not just that like Dobbs continues to have, kind of political juice behind it a year after it came down. It's much bigger than that. We have our politics where we talk about Hunter Biden and, which of the 28 states is Donald Trump going to be indicted in, and inflation and China and, what bat is guilty of COVID and all these different kind of things. But when you have actual elections in this country over the last 2 years, this is the big, big issue. It's the thing that drives lopsided results. And lopsided results in states where it doesn't seem to make a lot of sense, or at least it doesn't match with our understanding of political polarization, right? You have very conservative states, and abortion rights don't just win, they win overwhelmingly. And they don't just win overwhelmingly, they seem to have the ability to drive other election contests. And that remains one of the kind of the big unknowns going forward into this November, going forward into November 2024. I think it is widely believed, and I think rightly, that Dobbs was a major driver of the Democrats' surprisingly strong showing in November 2022. But in the nature of things, it's always hard to say, was it the issue in this particular race? Was it the issue in, the Arizona Senate race, the Arizona governor's race? Was it the issue in, the Georgia race? All these, it's hard to say, right? It's you have a lot of evidence, but elections are very overdetermined. And I think the big question, the big question is how many states are abortion rights advocates going to be able to get this on the ballot to give voters a shot to actually address this? Because at this point, I would say that outside of maybe a handful or a handful and a half of states, any state that gets a shot at this will vote for abortion rights. I don't, it's hard to say which states exactly. You have certain states that seem like wildly red, like Idaho, but they often have kind of like weirdly libertarian kind of instincts. I mean, my gut tells me it's kind of in the deep South is where these referendum might have the biggest problem. But in any case, outside of 7 or 8 states, it really seems like the only hope for abortion restriction is just to keep it off the ballot. Just don't let people get a shot at it. But still, the big question is, how much is this going to leverage other races? First, where are voters going to get a chance to make their voice heard on the issue? But where, if, when are we going to see on a broader stage what Gretchen Whitmer and a lot of other politicians and voters were able to accomplish in Michigan, where it reshuffles the political playing field in a whole state or in a whole country? It is crazy if Democrats are not making it the issue in 2024 to pass a national law making abortion rights the law of the land. Because, Republicans, kind of insane in political terms, but they actually walked into the breach, and they're saying we're going to do this 15-week national ban. Like, we're going to do it. You put us in charge. We're going to do it. So, the people who say, well, don't tempt fate. Republicans will do it if they're, well, of course they're going to do it. I mean, it's remarkable. My co-host Kate has written a few articles over the last few weeks showing how, despite the fact that it is now kind of almost universally understood by anybody who looks at election returns, this is like kryptonite for Republicans now. They have to change the topic. That in fact, in Congress, they're making everything about it. They're not just making abortion about abortion. They're making like esoteric budgetary stuff about abortion. Everything's about abortion, bringing it back to abortion. So, it's one of these things that is very difficult for, I mean, I'm not asking you to sympathize with them, but it's very difficult for a political party because, about 30% of the country wants to ban abortion, just ban it, or, 6-week ban, 1 week after conception ban, these sort of like absurd kind of bans, or, de facto bans. 30% of the country. No one wants to be on an issue with where the electorate supports you 30%. But the problem for Republicans is among their voters, it's like 65%. So good luck saying like, I guess the abortion thing didn't work out. Next, we're moving on from that. You can't do that. You can't do that. So they're in a bind. So we're going to talk about that. And in addition to being our co-host, it's particularly good for this because Kate is one of the best rising star repro rights, in addition to reporting about other issues, reporters in the country. So we're going to get deep into that. Then we're also going to talk about things tied to January 6th, the indictments, this Eastman guy who I've been tangling with. I mean, in my own head, right? At least, or on my editor's blog. We're going to get into that. But before we do, let me remind you that the Josh Marshall podcast is brought to you by Grady's Cold Brew Iced Coffee. Looking for the perfect cup of iced coffee, it's got to be cold brew. Cold brewing makes iced coffee that's smooth, less acidic, and way too easy to sip on all day long. And if you want the very best cold brew, it's got to be Grady's. The secret to their uniquely smooth cold brew is chicory. Chicory gives Grady's cold brew its distinct flavor, rich, slightly nutty, and even a little chocolatey. It lends a subtle sweetness for a well-balanced glass that doesn't need milk or sugar. And with the Grady's Bean Bag Bundle, you can make it at home for less than $1 a glass. Ready to give it a swirl? Get 25% off at Grady'sColdBrew.com with promo code TPM. That's Grady'sColdBrew.com with promo code TPM. Okay, Kate, you're back. What are we talking about?
So, AP ended up calling the Ohio race at 9 p.m. last night, which is an hour and a half after polls closed in Ohio. And there were some kind of informal markers even quicker than that. You've got your classic Dave Wasserman, I've seen enough. And that came like, I don't know, felt like 20 minutes after the polls closed. And it's funny because this is one of those races like that, like you said, there was just really like scant polling. We had maybe 2 or 3 polls. It's really hard to tell. Just kind of amid the like shaky polling landscape, an issue like this is going to be even harder because, as we said, it was pretty high turnout, but it's, judging high turnout against sleepy August election. So that's not saying all that much. And it's the kind of issue where it's easy to kind of gauge how people who are super politically tied in are viewing the issue, but it's a little bit weedy because, as you said, it's like this was kind of the technical threshold vote that is not directly related to the abortion vote, but obviously is related to it. And then you had Republicans kind of muddying the waters because I think they realized that making this about abortion was going to be a loser. So they tried, and our colleague Hunter and I did some various reporting on this, but they tried to wrap in all this kind of unrelated culture war stuff, particularly the anti-trans stuff, saying that, if this initiative to raise the threshold to 60%, if that fails, you're going to have kids getting sex change operations without parental consent. And, Hunter kind of asked the group that was behind this ad campaign, you know, what does that mean? And you can like tell how circuitous a route you have to take to get there. They're like, well, groups like the ACLU have a history of, pushing for sex change operations in children, which is, first of all, just not true. But then also, so this whole fear mongering thing is predicated on the idea that hypothetically, maybe someone will propose a ballot initiative that will get through all the procedural hurdles and the signature gathering requirements to get on the ballot that would, take away kind of parental consent requirements or something. I mean, it's ridiculous. It's like completely kind of pulled out of thin air. And I think that was a good sign that in this case, the Vote Yes campaign just had a much more convoluted pitch to make because they couldn't say what they were really doing, which is we're going to make it harder for you, the voters, to amend your own constitution. So they tried a little bit of the, we want to keep out of state special interests out of our politics. It's like, that's not really that captivating to people. You had our constitution is sacred and shouldn't be easily tampered with, but like, I think people already kind of understand that it's hard to amend. It's not like just anyone can do it. So then they did a little bit of abortion stuff, but half abortion stuff and half trying not to talk about the abortion stuff in a kind of a microcosm of this dynamic we've been talking about. And then you have the trans fear mongering and like put that all together. And like, that is a pretty convoluted and confusing message that you're trying to give people because they are trying to kind of get in the culture warrior people and then also get in like the Chamber of Commerce Republicans and kind of do a message that is palatable to everyone. Whereas if you're the no campaign, you've just got so many fallbacks. You've got the like just keeping the status quo, which is a pretty powerful thing, right? You've got this is about democracy. And then for some people, you've got this is about abortion. And then for other people, like a big part of this movement were labor groups in Ohio. So this is about hiking the minimum wage. This is about marijuana legalization. It's an easier sell because it's like you can kind of more reasonably tailor this argument to whatever people's pet issues are because
Right.
Ohio is one of the most drastically gerrymandered state houses in the country, I think second most. So kind of any of these popular proposals, they're not going to get through this state house. These are like super far right people. So you have an argument kind of stacked on top of each other that's going to attract a much wider swath of people. And then kind of you have all that plus, as you were mentioned in the intro, there's just kind of like juice and enthusiasm that all things abortion give voters right now, and especially in Ohio where this ballot initiative route is the only way they're going to have abortion rights. So it also has that kind of existential note on top of it.
It it's interesting that, I mean, what you've just described is really captures where the restrictionists are politically right now, because in a culture war context, no one cares. No one cares. Now, obviously, a lot of people care a lot about abortion rights, but I mean in the sense of, you people go up with ads about, you know, your son came home and suddenly he's a girl. There's that is obviously a very complex issue, but that's jarring to a lot of people. You get people's attention. You can really fearmonger about that. I think we all recognize this. Whatever wherever you are on the spectrum of parental rights, all the kind of stuff, it has a lot of charge. It's a new thing for a lot of people. It is frightening to a lot of people. You can't have an ad like, and then she got an abortion. Just no one cares. No one that doesn't the people who there is a third of the country who think abortion should be illegal. They know exactly where they stand. We know where they stand. There just aren't that many of them. But the idea that there will be places in the state where women can get abortions, that just it doesn't have the charge that conservatives use when they do these kind of ballot referendums. I mean, I remember, back in the 90s and 80s, Republicans would do these things about affirmative action. They would do them about immigrants. They would do it about, there was a sort of, the transformative issue in California, and I'm not going to remember. I think it's Prop 187. I think it was can't remember if it was in 1994 or 1996. I can't. In any case, California used to be what we would now call a purple state, and Pete Wilson got. I guess it wasn't initially his thing, but he kind of got behind it. A very draconian anti-immigrant state proposition, and it won. And it basically allowed him. I think it basically turbocharged his reelection. So it was a big winner for him. And again, this is I'm a little fuzzy on the exact details, even though I was watching this all very closely at the time. In any case, it was a big winner in the near term for conservatives, anti-immigration people. But basically what it did, it politicized California's Hispanic population. And the state has never been the same. There's a lot of reasons why California is as blue a state as it is now, but that is really a turning point, this Pyrrhic victory. In any case, in a different political world, it was Republicans who loved referendum, right? And would turbocharge their elections around them. Remember, back in 2004, a key thing that allowed George Bush to win re-election, although again, it's always hard to say exactly what the key thing was. A big thing was state referenda about gay marriage. And one of the critical ones was in Ohio. They got these. Karl Rove did a great job getting these on the ballot everywhere for the November 2004 election. You get a lot of people out, but now clearly it's Democrats who want these, because they're the ones who have the issues that there's a lot of public support for, but are jammed up in gerrymandered state legislatures, or in some cases, it's not even that they're gerrymandered exactly. It's, because think about it this way. J.D. Vance, this like feral douchebag, right? Who won for Senate, not even a good candidate, running against a really good candidate, Tim Ryan, the Democrat. He won pretty handily. That's not a gerrymandered thing. That's just the state, right? Sometimes it's just, which team are you on? even if you want abortion to be legal. Um, anyway, things are different today.
Yeah, and a really interesting wrinkle in the Ohio race is the degree to which it became like the first battleground in the 2024 Senate election there, which we know is going to be a huge one because Sherrod Brown is up for reelection. It's, in the top 3 kind of most vulnerable seats that Democrats have to defend, not because of Brown, who's kind of proven himself to be such an idiosyncratic Democrat that he's maintained like impressive statewide victories when nobody else can seem to manage it, but because it's just getting redder. It's kind of suffering from the inverse of the phenomenon that's making Georgia bluer, and some of these other states where you've got population growth, you've got influx of young people, you've got the suburbs blueing, and like all of that is kind of the opposite in Ohio. But you had Frank LaRose, who was currently the Ohio Secretary of State and is running against Brown in 2024, made himself the poster boy of this issue. And honestly, it was odd from the beginning. And I'm putting aside here the fact that he's Secretary of State and perhaps he shouldn't be politicizing like the nonpartisan bits of his current job. But even aside from that, there was never a lot of confidence that issue 1 was going to pass, even from the beginning. I've been talking to the kind of groups that are started to get the abortion piece on the ballot and then had to kind of transition into campaigning against this as well because the two are so linked. And they were always just like, well, it acknowledging the hardships of the legislature put this on the schedule for August for a reason. They're hoping like no one pays attention, and that's always an uphill battle and everything. But there's a pretty rich history of these kind of proposals failing miserably, even in red states, where they're kind of ostensibly aligned with Republicans. I mean, it's failed in Arkansas and South Dakota. Like, voters just don't like the idea of disempowering themselves for some crazy reason. So from the beginning, it was clear this was going to be an uphill battle. And you already had abortion as the big kind of energy producing piece of it. But LaRose, for whatever reason, just ran headlong at this, like made himself the biggest champion. Even you had the governor, Mike DeWine, kind of being a little hands off, being like, I don't necessarily want to really hitch my wagon to this one. But LaRose was all about it. He called on, Bernie Moreno and other people in the primary to like pony up $1 million each to give to the Vote Yes campaign. He was talking all the time about the sweat equity he's put in and how he's barnstorming the state, trying to rile up support. And he was going to have a press event when he cast his ballot, as if he's like a presidential candidate or something. Which, by the way, he canceled that press event because his team got wind that Vote No protesters were going to show up and like heckle. So he, profile and courage, decided to vote later in the day. But anyway, he just like he made this a big thing, and to the point where Moreno was being like, you're the Secretary of State, can you like focus on your job, and it was such a weird first thing to pick because it was, I mean, like I said, we didn't have a lot of polling, we didn't know for sure, but everyone kind of knew that it was going to be a much tougher get for the Vote Yes side than the Vote No side. And here you've got this guy who was probably kind of the presumptive front runner. He's definitely not as well funded as some of the others, but kind of has the most like traditional
He's like the
political
establishment
background. Exactly.
solid candidate guy who the power players want to run
Right.
against Jared
And had
Brown.
gotten his name out there in terms of like, in standing up to the big lie stuff in 2020, which he has since kind of really tried to get back in the big liar's good graces. But he also had he had something of a national profile because of that. But yeah, he just like chose to put it all on the line for this issue, which then he obviously got walloped on. And now it's going to be, he's going to have to field questions about like, did this represent bad judgment? Like, why did your effort fail so spectacularly? It was a bizarre kind of first fight to choose.
It is strange because you talked about it through the prism of other ballot initiatives about taking away the right to do ballot initiatives or to make it much harder, and those have had a bad track record. The other prism is abortion rights
Yeah.
referendums. And as we've seen, those have gone down in flames in some pretty red, in some pretty red states. So as you say, kind of like we didn't know, and that's going to make everybody kind of nervous. But like it just, if you watch these things, you had to figure it was going to be a pretty tough one. And yeah, it's I don't know why he went out on that limb. And just for context for our listeners, this is a guy who, when someone like Mitch McConnell looked at this race, he would say, "I want the LaRose guy."
Mm-hmm.
Didn't go, not too Trumpy. Had a little pushback. Enough pushback on big lie stuff, not to be the scary. What's Lake's first name?
Carrie Lake.
Carrie Lake, Carrie Lake in Arizona.
Who came to Ohio to campaign for the Vote Yes campaign, by the way.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, not that, got a kind of, traditional pre-Trump conservative, thing. And so he's kind of, I think the other two big candidates are basically either formally self-funding, or, they've got a lot of money behind them. And now, I think that the obvious line of attack that the other Republicans will use against him is that the state spent a fair amount of money putting this on. I mean, you also have a lot of pro-life groups who poured in a lot of money and just lit it on fire, basically. But in terms of political traction, putting on a statewide, Ohio's a big state, cost millions of dollars put on an election, and this was only for this. So they're going to say, like, dude, what was that about, right? And so I was saying in a post about this, I don't think it would. It's not that this would necessarily hurt him in a general election against Sherrod Brown, but he may not get to that election. He may go down in the primary, and I think that what is it? There's one of the candidates is he one of the Dolans, like the
Matt Dolan, a state senator.
Okay. Yeah, and his family owns what's now the Guardians, up in Cleveland, and then there's another more Trumpy guy who, I don't know, owns auto dealerships or something like that.
Yeah.
And so what you see here is the Republicans, because of the choice issue, may get boxed into kind of a 2022 replay where they've got a really vulnerable Democrat, but they end up, nominating kind of a wacky dude, and he loses. Now, Sherrod Brown is one of these, to me, and I'm sure to many of our listeners, Sherrod Brown isn't just any Democratic senator. You really don't want to lose him. I mean, he is a special senator. It's very true. He's got his own brand in Ohio, and he's done really well. But Ohio has been trending very hard Republican, and he was last up in 2018. Obviously, that was kind of not quite a wave year for a Democrat, but that was pretty good, kind of anti-Trump year. I'm not trying to make the argument against Brown's reelection. I mean, I really, really hope he wins, but that's a tough one. That is a tough one. And what a Republican friend of mine told me last night, and it's hard for me to have a good argument against it, in 2022, Republicans fielded a really crappy candidate against a good Democratic candidate, and JD Vance won by, I don't know, 10 points. I mean, I don't know if it was 10 points, but it was substantial. I mean, I think the counter to that is that Tim Ryan's not an incumbent.
Mm-hmm.
He ran a good campaign, but he's not an incumbent. I think this would be either Brown's third or fourth term. I can't remember exactly. But this has repercussions, and we're actually seeing this in, I forget it seems like Carrie Lake may run in Arizona. and
She'll
and
definitely run.
it all, yeah, okay, so and she still thinks she's got like a government in exile. She still thinks she's like Trump, right? She has her own little mini big lie, right? And it seems to me, I certainly get the sense that Kirsten Sinema, I don't think she's going to run. She doesn't want to end her career getting like 8% as a spoiler, right? So you have a lot of things coming together now. In a very, very hard Senate map for Democrats. But you have things coming together. Things look a lot like 2022, where Republicans just run a lot of really crappy candidates and let a lot of marginal Democrats make it through. So
The other
we'll see.
piece about LaRose I forgot to mention is that earlier this year, the Ohio legislature had passed a bill saying we're not going to have August special elections anymore because they're expensive, they're low turnout, like people expect to vote in November, they don't expect to vote in the summer. And LaRose, gave speeches at the time being like, this is a waste of taxpayer money and we're not going to do it and blah, blah, blah. Lo
Oh,
and
so he was
behold,
actually. So he's got all
reversed
his
himself.
quotes out there that he's going to be like pilloried
I
with now.
almost I honestly wonder if he had some kind of, like, big donor pressure to get behind this or something because it just seems in every way just, like, such a stepping on the rake for no reason.
It is. I mean, I was kind of underselling it before because as we've both said a number of times, the polling on these races is always very unclear,
Totally.
scattershot. You're polling a low turnout election, blah 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 blah. But I mean, you and I have been following these closely. I mean, it was kind of obvious this was going to go down in flames, right? Because it's not. Ohio's a big diverse state. It's not like, I mean, it's not like Kansas, where it also went down in flames, right? I mean,
Or Kentucky, yeah.
yeah, Kentucky, and I mean, Kentucky was closer, but still, it went down. So yeah, I mean, it is hard to figure. I mean, what? Um, it's a really good question. Was it some? I mean, in the other thing, and you alluded to this before, that to the extent that he needed to be dyed in the wool pro-life to maybe get the nomination or whatever, he had a perfectly good excuse. He's like, dude, I'm no one's more pro-life than me, but I'm Secretary of State, can't go there.
Mhm.
I'm like running the elections. I can't go there. But he did go there. So yeah, it's a mystery. I
Yeah. So
sort of
kind of
inexplicable to me.
now looking ahead, there are kind of a bunch of other states that have quite restrictive abortion regimes and then also allow citizen initiated ballot proposals. Those are Arizona, Arkansas, Florida, Missouri, Montana, Nebraska, North Dakota, Oklahoma, and South Dakota. And
But
some
those
of
are just ones where it's legal to do this, not where they've set it up, right?
Well, yeah, yeah. I
Okay.
mean, even though there are kind of efforts to varying degrees in all of these states, which is what I was going to get to is that in Florida, they're kind of already on track to gather the number of signatures to have it on the ballot in 24. In Arizona, they just released like the text of their constitutional amendment yesterday. Those are the two that are kind of the farthest along, and that will, it seems more likely than not, will have an abortion related proposal on the ballot in 24. Interestingly, Ohio, some of the people behind this told me wanted to go in 23 because they knew they'd be the only game in town and then would get kind of the national abortion related money, whereas 24, you get the benefit of having a high turnout presidential cycle, but there was always kind of the assumption that there are going to be a lot of these efforts in 24, so you're going to have to kind of compete. But Arizona and Florida, I mean, Florida to a lesser degree now, but it does kind of make sense that these places that already know they're going to be, you know, big money drains, big battleground states, are proposing their efforts then. Um, and then you have kind of a burgeoning effort in Missouri, which is funny because in Missouri, they're kind of taking the Ohio approach to things, which is they're both kind of slow walking. The Republican officials are slow walking the process of approving things so they can hopefully like delay it and punt it until after 24. And they're also considering doing exactly what Ohio did and announcing initiative to raise the threshold to 57%. And now, interestingly, this kind of came up during the term, and the 60% threshold like got through one of the chambers of the House, I think, and then the Senate did their version, which was different. And then at the conference committee, they kind of settled on 50%, 57% at being the right
That sounds so
anti-democratic
weird.
thing.
I mean, that almost seems like, did they look at the most recent poll and
I'm
like the most
sure.
recent was
Yeah.
56%, right? I mean,
But it kind of like it flamed out and died when they were considering doing this. And a lot of it was because, even some Republicans were like, people don't like these. They're not going to like it here. It's probably going to fail and we're going to look stupid while it fails. So that's kind of like foundering now. And we're not, it's kind of unclear whether that'll ever make it out of the legislature. But, it's what we've been saying, that if you've seen either the success of expanding abortion access or the kind of failure of passing restrictions in places like Kentucky and Kansas and Montana, like, of course you should put this on the ballot in Arizona and Florida. It's a no-brainer.
now let me ask you this, because it was only a little while into this Ohio buildup for this that I focused in on it, and that, as I understand this, in Ohio, you're voting for a specific piece of text that will be added to the state constitution. But I think many of us remember that, I don't know what it was, 5 or 6 years ago, they had a ballot initiative in Florida about enfranchising
Mm-hmm.
felons who had lost their voting rights. It won by a substantial margin. And then the state legislature said, oh, okay, you said to make a law about felons and voting. And they went ahead and just basically completely gutted it at the legislative level. Now, when I was finding out more about the situation in Ohio, at first I was like, are we sure they're actually going to let this happen? But in that case, as I understand this, it's just, here's the text, it's going to go in, like the legislature has nothing to do with it. In which, in across these different states, or like in Florida in 2024, which of them have this thing where specific text in the state constitution done versus kind of like we'll ask the legislature to do something and then the legislature can kind of kill it?
I mean, it's a real concern. It's funny because when I was talking to Ohio people about this one, that's something that one of them brought up was like, I feel pretty confident that this will pass numerically, but I'm worried that we're going to have kind of a redo of the redistricting situation, right? Where you had even the Ohio Supreme Court kind of tell the legislature, you need to redraw the maps. And they just were like, no, we shan't. And like, we'll see what happens. And
Right,
she was kind
right.
of telling me, like, I hope that the nationwide scrutiny and the kind of like big enthusiasm kind of prevents them from like tampering, like, will that be
Right,
enough?
right.
So, it's not totally clear to me. And also in Florida, you already have a 60% threshold for the ballot
Now, has that
initiatives.
always been the case, or they just did that recently? I'm trying to remember.
I
Did they
don't
change?
I don't quite
Maybe
remember.
always been the case.
Yeah. In Arizona, they have a heightened threshold, but just for tax increases. So, I don't know. It's interesting. It's like, it is this thing where the combination of like gerrymandering and also even the states that kind of have more traditional Republican Supreme Courts, like, that's just so quickly going extinct. And all those people are being kind of, as soon as they retire, replaced with like little versions of the US Supreme Court, that, we are getting to a place where these like right wing legislatures are just little dictatorships, like kind of unbound by anyone. And you're seeing this to the kind of most extreme degree with Alabama, which just lost that big Supreme Court case about redistricting, told to redraw their maps, and they're like, okay, we'll redraw it here, we did it, there's still one black district, you'll note.
Right,
And
right,
like,
right.
now it's just, that's just what they produced. And now it's, it's going to go through a federal court. It might end up at the Supreme Court again, where one would think that even the right wingers are going to be like, what the fuck, man? We like just decided this. But we are kind of like witnessing the full kind of the late stages of what's been going on since 2010, where like the radicalization of these legislatures are just now kind of shedding all pretense about being accountable to, much less voters, but even, state courts and federal courts.
Yeah, I mean, that point you made about Ohio, that many in many states you have, let's say, post-Trump Republican Supreme Courts that are kind of like whatever. But as you say, there, the state Supreme Court said, no, 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 you can't do this, and the legislature's like, okay, fuck you, and it just did it anyway.
Sounds
So
good.
yeah, exactly. So, so it's very interesting because one of the big Warren Court things, Warren Court jurisprudence, was what was then called one man, one vote, one person, one vote. The basic point is your system in your state has to basically people's vote count the same. It's never exactly the same. It can't be, some congressional districts, they don't have all exactly the same number of people. It's not possible to do that given that states have different populations. You've got to you got to get them close to something, but you have to be operating on that principle. And in especially in the South, but not only in the South, well into the 20th century, you had state legislatures where it was just, rural votes count 25 times more than urban votes. That's just how it is. Too bad, right? And again, a big Warren Court thing saying you can't do that. You can't do that. That is you can't do that. Now, ironically, we still do that in the federal Senate. That's exactly what we do, right? But you do have this broader issue in our politics that is not just gerrymandering. It is also concentration of more progressive, more liberal voters, that even if you made totally fair maps in some of these states, Republicans would, you'd have to do sort of a reverse gerrymandering to pull out the effect of the largely urban concentration of more bluish, more liberal voters. But you do have this basic issue, as you say, renegade state legislatures, where electorates overwhelmingly think X, and it's not just kind of like when you give them sort of fishy polls, right? About, are you do you think we should have rules that end school shootings? It's not just that. When they actually vote, but you have states legislatures just say no. And it's this basic issue of majority rule that we have, and it's really it's something central to our politics now that is really unresolved.
Totally. And just real quick before we move on to the Trump stuff, I wanted to mention that one part of this attempted Ohio change, like the threshold thing, was the piece that got the most attention, and rightly, moving into 60%. But the other piece would be that in gathering signatures to get these on the ballot, you would have to get them from every county in Ohio, some percentage from every county versus what it is now, which is some percentage from 44 of the counties. And it's so funny because it's kind of this like small procedural detail that I think slips by, but the issue with it is totally locked into what you're saying right now, which is that in Ohio, like in most states, vast majority of the population lives in the city centers, right? So in Ohio, it's 85%, live in the metro areas, which means all of a sudden now you want to pass a ballot initiative. You've got to get signatures from every like little podunk, most like Trumpiest county you can imagine. And if you fail to get enough signatures from one of those counties, you cannot be on the ballot. Like that is the death of your initiative. And it's so funny because this dynamic you're talking about, it's so permeates our politics on every single level that I think in some ways we're kind of like blind to it. You have it in the ways that get a lot of scrutiny in, you know, the electoral college, and the fact that in the Senate, Wyoming has 2 seats, as does California, you know, in these kind of like bigger ways that kind of intrude in life more. But it's across the board on every level. Like, it's a huge problem that our population is so lopsided, but the power is kind of like distributed evenly, or in theory evenly, throughout the, you know, the geographic uh bounds.
I always think of Wisconsin just because, I mean, because it's one of the most extreme cases, but I'm not sure it's that different from Ohio, or
Mm-mm.
maybe what Pennsylvania was. But what has always been so striking to me about Wisconsin, that in the last decade plus, the Wisconsin state legislature has sort of like oscillated between Republican majority and Republican supermajority, usually
Mm-hmm.
supermajority. And yet, when you have statewide races, it's a 50-50 state. You know, Scott Walker would win with like 51%. The current Democratic governor wins. He's won twice now, but again, 50%. The Senate races are 50%. That is, something is broken down there. It is absurd that the only question for legislative politics in Wisconsin is whether the governor has any power at all, because Republicans will always control the state legislature. It's just whether they have a supermajority, and highly gerrymandered, and that's why, as we know, you covered this for us, that a critical state Supreme Court election. One of
Mm-hmm.
the reasons it was so critical is that Republicans need the Supreme Court to be run by Republicans, because otherwise there's going to be some scrutiny. The fact that like people don't get to elect a legislature because it's so gerrymandered. It's this basic thing, and that's really, we're running out of time to get to the second half of the half of the
I
show
know we're
here
gonna go a little
about
long today. It's
about
okay.
about about January 6th. But so much of January 6th was really about this same issue: whether you could get these gerrymandered state legislatures to say, you know, we just don't feel right about how the election turned out. We're going to switch it. And in practice, the state legislatures, when it came to it, just weren't quite willing to go that far. But man, it was close,
Mm-hmm.
real close.
Yeah, that's a good segue in. We'll start with Eastman, and then we can kind of end with some Goldsmith dunking. But on Eastman, Josh, you've been writing about this in your ed blog, and Josh Kavinsky has written about it on the main site. But so Eastman sat down for this interview that I guess was released in 3 parts, with the guy, I'm forgetting his name, but he's the head of Claremont, right?
Yeah, his name's like Kligenstein or something. He's a big GOP donor, and as a big donor, he's the chairman of the board of the Claremont Institute. So
Right.
that's his role in this.
And for whether it be his donor status or his Claremont status that got him this interview, co-conspirator number 2 sat down with him to kind of chat on all things um, related to his kind of theory of election overthrow, and which included the really, as you put it, I think Eastman says, "Hell yeah, we were trying to overthrow the government." His very like candid expressions of what they were trying to do, but then he kind of like tries to root this overthrowing of the government, like, well, you know what? It's in the Declaration of Independence. This is what our founders envisioned. This is an intolerable government. So why don't you kind of like break that down a little bit for our listeners?
Yeah, well, if you haven't seen this interview, and I even seen like a screen capture of the interview or 10 seconds of it, it's it's very I don't know. It's this very, they're kind of in a library. The walls are covered with books, and they're kind of reclining, kind of, Bill Buckley style, in a little, comfy chairs, and having these like very Latinate, conversation. It's very genteel and everything. And the Kligenstein guy, and I don't, I'd never really heard of this guy before this. But anyway, he's walking Eastman through all the stuff. And it's a very funny thing because on the one hand, Eastman is saying all of his legal theories about we had a right to do this and we had a right to do that. But then at a certain point, he sort of can't help himself. And he goes into this stuff about the Declaration of Independence. And, I love the Declaration of Independence as much as the next guy, but he references the part where he talks about the right to overthrow governments. Like, okay, like that is there, but that's not really relevant in the internal legal structure of this government. You can't be in the house and out of the house at the same time, right? And I think it kind of slipped by people because again, there's so much like kind of chin scratching and everything in this conversation. But he's saying we had to, because Joe Biden was too big a threat. And it says right in the Declaration of Independence, we can abolish a government when we want to, if it's become too oppressive. So he kind of comes clean, which is good in a way, right? But he's such a I mean, it's good that he came clean and said, yes, we tried to say it's all these kind of legal theories and all this kind of stuff, but yeah, we'd had enough, and we didn't want to, we didn't like the result, and we were going to put in a new result. And he's just a people with a little intelligence can come up with very ornate explanations and logic puzzles that actually are just make no sense at all. And most of the stuff in there was like that. And it's a funny thing because I've been hearing about John Eastman like everyone else has for going on 3 years now as the kind of like as the the brains behind the coup, for lack of a better word. And it was only recently that I realized that he's part of that whole kind of Claremont Institute, Claremont Colleges kind of that thing. I thought he was just like a Chapman University or Pepperdine or one of those kind of like right-wing colleges they have out in Southern California, sort of quasi degree mills. Shouldn't quite say that about Pepperdine, but kind of. But I didn't realize he was one of those guys. And here's the funny thing. So I actually I grew up right there, and I actually went to high school in Claremont, in that area. And actually, one of my high school teachers was sort of a devotee of the guy who, all that Claremont Institute, Claremont Colleges thing. It's about this guy Harry Jaffa, who was a disciple of this guy Leo Strauss, who's this Straussians, West Coast Straussians, East Coast Straussians. There's some interesting people involved in this, but a lot of very self-regarding people too, with I don't know, Straussians and this and different schools and the little fights they have and everything. So anyway, I was kind of reared in a bit of this stuff through this teacher I really liked in high school. And then when I got an internship after my sophomore year of college at what was then kind of the sort of the think tank where all these guys run. The Claremont Institute was just starting back then. This would have been like in 1989. All right. So I was a research assistant for Harry Jaffa, who lived into his 90s. He only died in like 2015 or something like that. But he was a pretty old guy in 1989. So I was researching for him and this other guy, George Benson. Anyway, I spent the summer kind of shooting the shit with this guy and like Xeroxing things and like looking things up for him and stuff like that. It was a very interesting guy, but I kind of know these people, and it's amazing that their bullshit has kind of intersected with our politics in in the way that it has. And I didn't realize that Eastman was part of that thing, that specific thing. And it's wild because it now seems like he's gonna get indicted on some pretty serious felonies, it sounds like.
The part of the interview that really gets me is when he is talking about the intolerable state of things, right? And how, like, when a citizenry is kind of put in this, like, in this sufferable position, they've got no choice. It is the noble thing to do to kind of throw off the yoke of the government. And it's like, cool. So, what, like, threshold of the citizenry have to agree with that for it to be appropriate to throw over the government, right? Like, I mean, kind of by his theory, I guess you're saying like 35% tops are the kind of discontents by the time you're allowed to sack the Capitol.
I guess if you really want to go, I mean, one of the things I did in this post was say how this was a big thing in the first decades of the American Republic, because you have this founding document, which is not a legal document. It's sort of a very high toned press release where we announce like what we're doing and why we're doing it. Okay. And it does make this argument that which was much more radical at the time than it is now, which is saying that governments only exist to serve the governed, right? They don't like the King of England basically owns England. It doesn't matter like who, that's all that matters, really. A little more complicated in England, but that's the world that existed in the 1700s. And what the authors of the Declaration of Independence were saying was that no, if it's not working for the governed, you move on, you start over. That's cool, that's okay. And it does say that. But what in the early political history of the American Republic, you have this kind of problem because everybody can't do that all the time, or else you can't really run everything. So there's this kind of question of, okay, it was cool then, but now we've got another thing going on. So you can't just like be declaring independence right and left every time you don't get what you want. So how's this work? And this has to do with like contract theory and all the kind of stuff that people thought a lot about in the 17 and 1800s. What they came up with is that that's not a legal right. We've got a constitution. You can't, if you break the law, you break the law. It's a revolutionary right. Everybody at any time can just say, I'm out. And you don't need any particular percentage and whatever. Just anybody can do anything. You better hope you win, because if you don't, you're in trouble. But just morally, you have the right to say, I've had enough. And again, revolutionary right, legal right, constitutional right. They're different things. And this comes up several times over the course of early part of the 19th century in the United States. And it's a big thing. It's a big thing in the Civil War, because the secessionists try to hang their hat on this, like, oh, Declaration of Independence, what could be more American? And Lincoln is very clear on this. Like, everybody has a right to, you can do whatever you want, but the government has a right to kind of, you can try to overthrow the government. Government has a right to say no, right? And so it's there, and he's right in the sense that, like, if you decide it's not working, the Declaration of Independence says you have this basic moral right to say I'm out. But again, government has the right to say, no, you're not out. Right. And but what was so interesting about it to me is, again, that is coming clear and saying it's a coup. You're trying to overthrow the government. This isn't like a really novel legal theory or something like that. You're trying to overthrow the government, and it's good that you have come clean and said that. It's not a good argument in court. Not at all, right?
I kind of like the Eastman team squeamishness, though. Like, the idea that, the Declaration says we can we can try to overthrow the government, so we can. It's like, okay, cool, sure. So, like, by this reading, is King George supposed to have just been like, "All right, high five, lads. Like, we won this one as you were. A good game. See
Yeah,
you next time." I like that
yeah.
he like kind of curtails the ramifications of your action bit, the government gets to fight back bit. Like, I don't think he endorses that part quite so full-throatedly at this particular moment.
Well, it's something that it is more than alluded to in the document itself, but was also clear. The authors of the Declaration of Independence, the people in the Constitutional Congress, had no unclarity about the fact that they were committing treason in their relationship to Great Britain, and that if they lost, they would all be hanged. They were all in. And again, they said this all the time. Our lives, our fortune, our honor, we're all in. There's no going back. And so it is ironic that Eastman, and again, there's a lot of grandiosity in that world he's from. They're very hardcore, they're revolutionaries, but then they're like complaining about being canceled
Right.
or that they're being indicted. And like, dude, you're lucky you're just being indicted, right? Coups get messy.
Yeah.
So as is often the case, people want their revolution and their mulligan at the same time, or kind of like, a coup 5-second rule.
Yeah.
It didn't work. So come on,
You're fine. It's fine.
I picked it up really quickly and I can still eat it.
Just blow it off. It's fine.
Yeah, it's okay.
So to end with, we're gonna finish on this Jack Goldsmith column in the New York Times that our listeners may have seen because in the kind of burning wreckage that is Twitter or X, it got a lot of airtime from people kind of dunking on it. And the title is something along the lines of, prosecuting Trump is a terrible idea. And in it, Goldsmith kind of his basic argument is one we've actually seen from conservatives a whole bunch of times, but it's just this prosecution will increase the politicization of the DOJ, will convince a wide swath of the country that that institution is, not to be trusted, that it was a political endeavor, that Biden was having his kind of henchmen go after Trump, and that will be so deeply damaging to our institutions and to our social fabric that it's kind of better not to do it. And then he wraps in all these kind of other, like the New York prosecution was quote unquote dubious, the DOJ shouldn't have slow walked this. You have Hunter Biden's sweetheart deal, and all of these things will just kind of increase the atmosphere of distrust and continue to kind of degrade our institutions and our citizenry, our common citizen trust and all the rest.
Yeah, it's there's no end of Trumpy freaks who have who rationalize everything Trump does, and we hear those things all the time. They're best disregarded, right? In the same way that you don't answer trolls on Twitter and stuff like that, or you shouldn't, even though I do constantly. But the thing is, Jack Goldsmith is not that guy. He is he's a big time national security law expert. That doesn't mean you agree with everything, but he's not a hardcore partisan, or doesn't seem like a hardcore partisan. So when he says something like this, it gets attention, and I guess rightly gets attention. But the article was, or the column was just sloppy and lazy, because it's a big deal, and it is not a good thing at all for the current president to have his DOJ prosecuting the previous guy. Of course that's bad. Of course that's damaging. Everybody knows that. Everybody knows there's lots of reasons why you don't want to get there. But his column basically just ignored the other side of the equation. Is it really the case that a president loses re-election and then tries to have a coup to stay in office anyway, and you don't do anything. Well, that's it. I mean, to me, it is a big deal to do what is happening right now for exactly the reasons he says. You don't want to let that genie out of the bottle, where there's in this kind of in the same sense that we have with impeachment now. I don't think anybody really think. I mean, it's a joke to think that anything is with Joe Biden is anywhere, but they want to impeach Joe Biden because Trump was impeached. You got to impeach everybody now, and to me, kind of like, who cares? I really don't care. Indicting, you don't want to get into that pattern, but again, Republican government doesn't work if people can use violence and state power and fraud to reject elections. So to me, again, the comparative weighting is pretty clear that you have to do this for the reasons that all of us have probably talked about with each other and with our families for the last 2 years. But with his column, he just ignored that other part and kind of like, oh, we can't politicizing the DOJ, criminalizing politics. Yeah, no shit, dude. No kidding. But that's where we are. And to even be in the conversation, you've got to address those other points. It surely cannot be the case that you have immunity for a coup because you were president, or because you want to be president again, or because you're on Twitter or Truth Social saying the indictment isn't fair. Like, that can't be the case, because then everything falls apart. So it's just I try to. I'm perfectly capable of being nasty and aggressive with people who I think are just liars and terrible people. But in this case, again, I think what he thinks and says is important. I just think it was, he didn't address the real question, and I think that was lazy.
It keeps reminding me of when people kind of say, like, this investigation is unprecedented, the indictment is unprecedented. It's like, well, yeah, but
Who got us
so
there?
was the underlying action, right? It's like, it's so weird to me to kind of like focus on the ramifications as being the kind of like crazy first in a generation time it's happening. It's like, well, yeah, because like when the first person does something unprecedented, therefore the reaction is also unprecedented, And there is some like just like kind of weird, snarky stuff in the column as well. He kind of opens by being like, as fun as it may be for some to watch this, which is like,
Yeah, it's
okay, shut up.
condescending.
Like,
It's
he did a
condescending.
coup,
Yeah,
relax. Like, people are
yeah.
allowed to want to see justice for that. He also does some weird kind of like casting of aspersions on Jack Smith's motives and stuff, all of which I think kind of like muddy the waters and make it all seem a little bit like right wing agitator ish, which, as you say, doesn't seem to be his kind of usual MO.
Yeah, that was the kind of thing that I when for those of you who haven't read the column, he says like, well, look how the Mueller investigation
Mm-hmm.
went. That was pretty lame. Well, really? I mean, that doesn't seem like facts and evidence to me. That Hunter Biden getting a sweetheart. Well, I mean, dude, really? Like,
Also, isn't the Mueller thing the thing he professes to want, which is that the criticism of Mueller is that he was so overcautious that he ended up being ineffective.
yeah. I mean, I think that is a case where, look, Goldsmith is a Republican. He's definitely not a Trumper by any stretch. He's 100% not. But we all kind of have an osmotic relationship with our milieu. And my only explanation of those comments is that, because I'm not saying you've got to be like, Hunter Biden's biggest fan. But this whole thing about, I mean, look, they bent over backwards to leave this Trump appointed guy in charge of the investigation for like 2.5 years. The idea that this was like a kind of like a, you know, that they had it wired, that they kind of, it was all agree, really that. But I do think that, that was necessary for him to sustain the larger argument. Well, after all these terrible errors at the Department of Justice, now you're going to do one more thing that's just going to, bring it into more disrepute. Well, is that really where we're at here? Has the DOJ really, and even the idea that there's a DOJ, it changes a lot in its leadership from, I mean, let's be clear. We're talking about things that happen in the Trump DOJ. Is it really the case that, federal law enforcement and the FBI and the DOJ, man, just they've been caught with their hand in the cookie jar so many times. You're gonna do yet another thing that's just gonna, you know, sow suspicion about, or is it really that the country, for going on a decade, has been dealing with this lawless, criminal, would-be dictator, and it's been a bumpy ride for our institutions to deal with that. And I think that's the reality of what's going on. That doesn't mean you can't find mistakes in one, in one warrant or something like that. But yeah, is he going like full, full Durham investigation? I don't know what that's about. It's weird. And at the end of that column, he says this thing about, Trump's election shenanigans. I mean, it's not a shenanigan. I mean, that is just kind of like, things got a little messy. I mean, give me a break, dude. I mean,
Yep.
The law has to be able to defend itself. And there are people in this country who recognize that Trump is a lawless person and a threat to our system of government. At the end of the day, it's about elections, right? The people can decide to make decisions that kind of shut us down. But he certainly did sound in some of those kind of throwaway lines like someone who's operating outside of that basic understanding of where we are, and that, everybody makes their choices.
It's also just like the gazillionth iteration of people being like, well, we need to kind of treat Trump with kid gloves here because he was the president and that matters. And it's like, they are, okay? They have treated him with kid gloves throughout in every one of these cases. If he had been treated like a normal dude, he would be in jail, and he's not.
Yeah.
And that is
Yeah.
manifested in all kinds of ways, including, the National Archives being like, pretty please give us the documents back, and giving him like all this like scheduling leeway. I mean, it manifests in every single sense. And it's this, he's not doing quite as much of the Trump aggrievement tour as the kind of usual actors, but there's some of that as well. His argument is more of a kind of like historical institutional vantage point, but Trump's still the person we're talking about here.
Yeah, and I think with there's treating Trump with kid gloves, but a key part of his argument is this is going to make a big chunk of the country not trust federal law enforcement, not trust the Department of Justice, not trust the FBI. And like, yeah, there is some of that. But again, what he doesn't reckon with is, what about the people who think the results of elections are sacrosanct and operate on that basis? What'll they think? What'll they think if there's always this issue? This comes, and this is something that some people more than I do think this is a basic crisis in the country and in American political culture more generally, a basic crisis of you never, it is very dangerous to the law to make the people who follow the law feel like maybe they're chumps. Like, am I the chump here? Is it really okay to do anything? Is it okay not to pay your taxes? Is it okay to, like, you get subpoenaed for stuff and you hide it and you light it on fire? Am I the chump for following the rules? That is at least as great a threat to institutions, to the rule of law. You have to vindicate the idea that the law means something. And again, what he just doesn't take any cognizance of, not that he's got to agree with me or agree with anybody else, but you got to at least address the issue. What about the people who follow the law? What about the people who see that the sitting president thought he was just going to pull some bullshit and stay president even though he lost the election? I mean, it's really a remarkable thing that now, going on a decade, we've had 2 elections where quite explicitly one of the candidates kind of says, we'll see what happens if I lose, to kind of keep it open. And, that is for all that we had the 2000 election, that's a new thing in this country. Yeah, you can have, litigation and whatever, but this idea that we'll see what happens, dude, you can't have that. And again, we're all we become used to it now. Imagine if both say, like, I'm gonna, the answer is like, are you gonna, accept defeat? You say, of course I would accept defeat. It's not going to happen. I'm going to win. But of course I do. Blah, the basic statements of homage to the system of government we operate in, which is you lose, you move on. And to the extent that Goldsmith is saying, because the other part of that is you move on, but you're allowed to move on. You go back to what you were doing. And he's saying here, well, you don't want this risk that that the new guy's gonna come after you. Well, it's a two-way street. You lose, you move on. And if you've got someone who's introducing this new set of rules, which is, maybe I won't move on. Maybe I'll see what I can do. Maybe I'll talk to my friends in this state or that state, and they'll just decide I won anyway. The whole system can't function that way. The election brings finality, and he has introduced what he wants to be a new set of rules, that it's not finality. It's, I'll see what I can do. And republics can't survive that. It's simple as that.
All right.
Well, I'm almost breaking my rules and getting as grandiose as those Straussian douchebags over in Claremont. So I'm going to try to reel myself in. I want to remind everybody that, remember, the Josh Marshall podcast brought to you by Grady's Cold Brew Iced Coffee, 25% any order if you use the promo code TPM at Grady'sColdBrew.com. I guess that's all we got.
See you next week.
Later.
The Josh Marshall podcast is hosted by me, TPM reporter Kate Riga, and TPM founder, editor-in-chief Josh Marshall. The show is produced by Jackie Wilhelm. Thanks to Why Not Jansfeld for our podcast theme song, and thanks to all our TPM members who make this possible. Rate and review us on Apple Podcasts, and subscribe wherever you listen.